We've just been through 4 years of a fascist regime in power attempting to consolidate a fascist rule in this country. The fundamental problem is this system itself, which continually will regenerate fascist movements. The electoral defeat of the Trump-Pence regime only buys some time. Fascism is an open and aggressive dictatorship trampling on and perverting the rule of law, relying on violence and terror on behalf of the predatory capitalist system.
Welcome to episode 51 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of this show. Before we share today's interview with Andy Z, we want to express our solidarity with the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Our hearts go out to the families of those who were killed in the heinous act of misogyny and racism in Atlanta. Our love goes out to the victims. You have a story that must be told, but will never be known. Our hearts go out to all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that have been terrorized by xenophobic violence fueled by the Trump regime's use of the COVID-19 pandemic to further white supremacy. We recall Portland 2017. We recall Pittsburgh 2018. We remember El Paso 2019, Atlanta, March 16th, 2021. Patriarchy, xenophobia, white supremacy have not been confined to policy or rhetoric. Until we as a society reckon with the still growing fascist movement in this country, we are all complicit. It's on us to stop Asian hate. For those wondering what this 21st century American fascism is, March 16th was a good reminder. White supremacy, the belief that white people should dominate over all others. Male supremacy, the belief that men should dominate over women and children and adhere to oppressive traditional notions of quote-unquote manhood. Xenophobia, the belief that so-called foreigners are dangerous, evil, subhuman, and exist only to be exploited, sexually or otherwise. Christian theocratic patriarchy, the belief that biblical law should dominate all of society and men should rule over that society the way that God rules over humanity. It is one of the main organizing forces of the fascist movement. All of this has to be enforced by violence and terror, especially a vengeful violence against anyone who challenges or does not conform to those fascist beliefs. It is a coherent and ultimately genocidal worldview, and it will kill more people unless we stand together to drive it out of society. Now, let's listen to my interview with Andy Z. All right. Well, I am so excited to get the opportunity to chat with Andy Z, host of the RNL show. Andy is also a co-initiator of RefuseFascism.org. And if you are a regular listener of the Refuse Fascism podcast, you have heard commentary from Andy previously. You've also heard his remarks at a series of forums that Refuse Fascism has done. Today, we're talking about a really important piece that came out in January from revolutionary leader Baba Avakian. New Year's statement by Baba Avakian, a new year, the urgent need for a radically new world for the emancipation of all of humanity. So I wanted to start with the question that this statement talks a lot about the ties between the US fascist political movement and the system, meaning the system of capitalism imperialism, and how this system of capitalism imperialism has brought forth this political movement, the US fascist political movement. And if you could explain the links between fascism and this system of capitalism imperialism that Avakian's getting at in this statement, and why you think that matters, that people understand that connection.
It's an important question because it's a big part of this statement. The statement itself provides an orientation for the whole political situation that we face going forward, and it gets deeply into what gave rise to this fascism. That's really a decisive question. We've just been through 4 years of a fascist regime in power attempting to consolidate a fascist rule in this country. A different form of governing and of rule within the same confines of the system itself, which is, as you pointed out, the capitalist imperialist system. At the very beginning of the statement, Bob Avakian points out that as sharp as this divide is between the Republicans, or often reviews fascism, we call them the Republi-fascists, and the Democratic Party, which represents the ruling capitalist imperialist consensus over a whole period of time, is a contention at the top of society how to best administer an empire and a system that depends on the exploitation of people here and around the world. And that actually isn't the fundamental divide, the fundamental division, the fundamental problem that the masses of people here and around the world face. The fundamental problem is this system itself, which continually will regenerate fascist movements and at times fascism coming to power in different countries around the world, which has been a phenomenon in the last period. We've seen that in this country, which did have extremely dire actual effects, and should it have consolidated fully a fascist rule, it would have been quite catastrophic. But the system itself is a system that continues to and can only continue on the basis of this massive exploitation and oppression. So this is the foundation of the statement. And what do we do about this? And it's a strong argument for that. Yes, the danger of fascism reconsolidating is a very strong possibility, but that takes place in the context of the workings of the system itself, which will regenerate this. And it directs people to really take an approach to understanding the workings of this system, what the problem we actually face that has given rise to this, and then what is the actual solution in a revolution to overthrow this system and bring about a far better world through an actual revolution on the basis of this new communism, which is a tremendous liberating advance for humanity. The first stages of communism in the 20th century were the first steps in trying to liberate the masses of people from an oppressive system. They were defeated ultimately, principally by the power of imperialism and capitalism and being surrounded, but also by internal weaknesses in their method and approach that Avakian has gone to work on and developed a new communism that's much more scientific, less involved in subjective kinds of approaches to this, and has come up with the Constitution for a new socialist republic. So the relationship between the struggle against fascism, your question, and the nature of the system itself, that relationship has to be understood correctly. There was an urgent need to try to mobilize the masses of people to drive this regime out, which is what Refuse Fascism tried to do and actually made a lot of contributions to the struggle. We weren't able to succeed in that. The situation was such that massive numbers of people did vote. There was enough of a defeat of Trump in the election that he wasn't able to stay in power, even despite trying a coup d'etat of sorts, however ill-conceived. All of this is indicated in this statement, but it goes deeply into the problem and the solution.
Thank you, Andy. I think it would be helpful for the listeners to hear a little bit about words like capitalism, imperialism, and they have certain understandings of what those words might mean. But if you could break it down a little bit more about what you mean by capitalism, imperialism.
Sure. And I would encourage people to go to the website revcom.us and to the work of Avakian, where this is broken down. I can do some brief things here. The statement itself is not a full course in capitalism or imperialism. It's actually talking about what the impact has been. But look, we live under a system that's an economic system at its base. Every society is a way to provide for the needs of its people to survive, to live, and to reproduce and create new generations. And human history has gone through many different kinds of systems. They're not permanent. That was one of the discoveries of Marx. But at its root, this historically limited system of capitalism, imperialism is a system of producing things, commodities, for exchange, not producing things for trading goods, but producing things. And the most important commodity under capitalism is people's ability to sell their labor power. They themselves are a commodity. Capitalist imperialism is a system that depends upon the competition between different capitalists, different blocks of capital that actually get put together in nations. And all of this is a competition over essentially who can more efficiently exploit the masses of people to produce the goods for sale as commodities. That's why it's called a dog-eat-dog system. That's why it's called the survival of the fittest, and applies that to capitalism itself. It gives rise to wars and competitions among the big superpowers. It's why the superpowers exploit what's called the third world. It's competition, yes, for resources, but all of that is fundamentally to gain competitive advantage. It's not a system where goods are produced for the needs of the people. It's a system where things are produced only if they can make a profit for some capitalist or group of capitalists, which is within a country. But this system has on top of it a whole set of social relations, of government, and of ideas. And the form of this system has been preferred form by the capitalist class, is what we call a bourgeois democracy, which means a democracy that serves the interests of this system. That's what we have. It's actually a dictatorship over the masses of people. Why I say dictatorship, Baba-Vakian office, it's not some guy banging his shoe on a desk as Khrushchev did, or just issuing edicts and orders, although that's part of a fascist form of rule. But it is, even in the bourgeois democratic form, it's a form of dictatorship. You don't have a right to eat under this system. You don't have a right to a house. Sometimes in the very rich countries, there's some limited rights in those spheres, but they're dictated to you. You don't get to pick the people and the values you would want. I think a lot of people in this country would say that women should have the right to control their own bodies and determine their own futures, that we should live sustainably. But you're not going to get to vote on that. And to the degree you get to vote on such a thing, you vote on it within the confines and ways that the system itself will function. Nobody sat down and wrote this out on a piece of paper. Here's the system we want. It evolves historically out of the system that came before, the King of England, feudalism, all this kind of stuff. The history of this country is one of white supremacy, of slavery written into its constitution. And you've had this divide in this country, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the hatred of foreigners woven into every fabric of society. Let me just say this about capitalism and imperialism. It's a very dynamic system. And one of the things that Baba-Vakian does in this piece, he goes very deeply into how the changes that capitalism has wrought in the world economically, the integration of women into the workforce, the moving of jobs into a globalized economy, leaving the Black working class, if you will, in the inner cities where people had migrated from the South with no sustainable form of living and such. Then you have their criminalization of a whole generation and their mass incarceration. At the same time this is happening, there's also struggles that came up in this country, particularly in the 1960s, demanding rights for these sections of the people who at that time, there was more U.S. hegemony in the world, and there was some room for that to more flourish. And people were brought into the factories actually in the wake of the rebellions of the 60s. But then all of that was wiped out. And yet you have a section of the population who feels very aggrieved by all of this, including they feel that they're losing their country. Leonard Pitts, who's a columnist for the Miami Herald, wrote an article where he said, we really do have, and we have to face the fact that there's two countries within one border. And that's what you see arrayed in this struggle between the fascist movement and the larger section of society who we were trying to, in Refuse Fascism, mobilize to actually create a situation where the Democrats took decisive action to drive it out of power along with voting, even as we were trying to do this way before that, because it would have put the people and their interests in a much stronger position than what has resulted, which is, yes, Trump out of power. That's a big, big, big change. But it's also one in which the fascist movement itself, while in a certain amount of disarray, is also recoalescing and in certain ways has been strengthening, even as they're not ready to make a move for total power again. And when they do, it will be even more serious probably than the last time.
Thanks for that, Andy. I did want to pose one thing about the Leonard Pitts Jr. quote and Avakian's response. Pitts wrote, the last time that happened, talking about the cleaving of society with the Civil War, it took 4 years and 750,000 lives to force us back into some semblance of oneness. Even then, the seams of the fracture were always visible. Unlike that break, this one is not starkly geographic, South versus North. No, this one is city versus country, college educated versus high school educated, and most significantly, future versus past, meaning that yesterday, this was a nation where white people were the majority, and tomorrow it will be one where they are not. And I encourage people to read in full Avakian's response. I'm just going to bring forward part of it for the purpose of this discussion. Avakian talks about something that you alluded to in your recent response was that the divide and the clash between the past and the future goes deeper than demographic changes and the prospect of a majority non-white U.S. population. The forces fighting for the past are aiming to reverse with a vengeance. Even the modest concessions that have been made to the fight against social justice and institutionalized inequality and oppression, and to enforce a form of capitalist dictatorship that is overt and unrestrained by the Constitution and the rule of law, or which turns the Constitution and the rule of law into merely instruments of fascist tyranny and atrocity. I was wondering whether you could speak more to the texture of the divisions that we're now seeing, in particular post this 4 years of having a genocidal white supremacist in power.
Well, I think one thing to understand, there's 74 million people, or maybe 75, I don't know, voted for Trump. And that's a significant section of the country. Yes, there's 330 million people in the country, and 81 million or 82 million voted for Biden. But it's a significant section of the country that is okay with, and more than okay with, willing to support an open white supremacist, an open misogynist pig, an open absolute cruel xenophobe, a fascist who was willing to go out and absolutely speak untruths and mobilizes people behind the most outlandish conspiracy theories, complete abandonment of truth, to be able to say that only Trump can save America. Okay, well, what did this actually represent? This represents a section of people who want to restore the America of their imaginations on the one hand, but also the America in reality that was one where white people were respected, where women knew their place, where no longer were there any LGBTQ people even around to be able to threaten their whole conception of who they are and what's right. A whole section of people who've been reared over about 40 years by a Christian fascist movement, a form of Christian fundamentalism, largely in the evangelical movement, but also there's a section of the Roman Catholic Church that is extremely reactionary, including a Supreme Court Justice now, Amy Coney Barrett, who want to restore a form of biblical literalism, to completely overthrow any concept of objective truth, but to set inside a bunch of traditional values as a way to rule this country. They feel that what makes America great is exactly these massive, massive inequalities, that's what you need to cohere a country that is becoming minority white, that needs to dominate the rest of the world and not pussyfoot around and all these kinds of liberal things that they see as a threat. So this is continually being engendered by the kinds of changes that the system itself is creating. Like I said, the displacement of jobs and then the abandonment of whole urban areas. To maintain any semblance of a middle-class life, women have to be working. And in fact, many of the men won't work in these families because they don't want to do women's work that they consider beneath them. So you have a tremendous tearing at the social fabric of this country that is fueling the movement of revenge. And it's also revenge against the struggles of differently gendered people, of women, of Black people, of other Native American people, all these things. And it's a source of tremendous mockery. And in order to justify this, you have to have the departure from reality that's represented by taking the Bible literally and by all kinds of QAnon stuff, which is actually no more fanciful than the Bible itself. You said to give the texture of this, the other side of this is you do have a country that's at the top of the food chain and a vast, vast middle class, and even down into the lower strata of people. Most of them, not all of them, by the way, but most of them can go into a room in their house and turn a knob and get water. For the poor, it might be poisonous and be completely infused with lead and various other carcinogens. But nonetheless, that's different than it exists in what's called the third world. And this section of people, too, has their own delusions. Pivotal point in this message, a new year, an urgent need for a radically new world for the emancipation of humanity, is Bob Avakian is struggling with people, the people who do want justice in the world, the decent people who do want to see equality, to apply the same rigor that they would apply to overcoming the pandemic to actually society itself and look deeply into the actual causes and what's fueling this fascism, and not just to the superficial, everything from the buffoonery to the superficial phenomenon that you see many of the anti-fascism scholars. All they can really do is list 13, list 10, list 9, things that are sort of like fascism. They never actually get to what's actually driving this, why it comes about, why it's an actually different form of rule of the same system. And if it's a different form of rule of the same system, then Where did it come from? Well, it came from within the system itself as a different way to rule that system, and not a rupture from that system and overthrowing of that system, and bringing about a system that would put forth and have a form of government and an economy that would actually meet the needs of humanity. Now, I don't know if that answered your question on texture. Right now, I don't know how it's going to go over a period of time. Right now, there's a lot of even more political passivity among the people who, oh, good, and now it's all taken care of. My tax dollars pays other people to take care of the world for me, and they are going to take care of the world. They're going to fuck up and destroy the world. That's what they're going to do. And that's what they do, but they do it in a way different than the constant assault on the norms of society of the Trump-Pence regime. Where this goes, we'll have to see. But the Democrats cannot make a fundamental rupture from the very things you hated. So yes, there's a settlement in Minneapolis right now of something $23 million to the family of George Floyd, and a trial is beginning of the pig who killed him, Derek Chauvin. And whether or not there's any kind of conviction there, which shouldn't even be a question. The whole world saw that this man murdered this other man, but now they're putting in lesser charges in the hope of getting some kind of conviction. You can imagine if for somehow the script were flipped and there was a black man kneeling on a white cop's neck, that person would have been executed on the spot. So, but the Democrats, there's things that they can do, a semblance of all this, but are they going to really uproot? Can they uproot white supremacy from this system? No, they can't, because to do so would once again tear the whole country apart. So the texture of things is going to be one of this revenge-filled movement trying to regroup behind Trump or some other fascist force on the one hand, and extremely sharp divides, and on the other, people who want a world of justice, but largely being confined within the framework of the Democratic Party and what's sensible politics, which means on the terms of the system itself.
Thanks for that, Andy. I wanted to dig into a very short excerpt that I'm going to read that I think is one of the most important to me in this piece, and discuss it a little bit with you. Avakian states, "The electoral defeat of the Trump-Pence regime only buys some time, both in relation to the imminent danger posed by the fascism this regime represents, and more fundamentally in terms of the potentially existential crisis humanity is increasingly facing as a consequence of being bound to the dynamics of this system of capitalism imperialism." And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this. What is this existential crisis that even if fascism wasn't on the table, which he is not saying that has gone away, but even if that wasn't on the table, what would that crisis be? Why is this so important to pay attention to in the context of us having some time to actually go to work on this?
He does say right there that the electoral defeat of the Trump-Pence regime only buys some time, both in relation to the imminent danger posed by the fascism this regime represents, and more fundamentally in terms of the potentially existential crisis that humanity is increasingly facing as a consequence of being bound to the dynamics of this system. There's two aspects to that. One, which is the fundamental divisions in society of the world and between the masses of people here and around the world, is not just the polarization between the Democrats and the Republicans, but between the masses of people here and around the world and the system that we live under, which gives rise to fascism. This is where, in terms of a scientific approach to reality, this is what Karl Marx developed and Vakians developed further, dialectical materialism, which is to say the world as it actually is and everything is contradiction. So there's a contradiction. I mean, we've been dealing with that contradiction in Refuse Fascism. The contradiction at the top of society is extremely sharp. And if one side won, if Trump had won, it could have been absolutely catastrophic very, very quickly for humanity. And we weren't in position to overthrow the system. So at that time, we had to try to call forth the masses of people to stand up and to get outside the bounds of politics as usual, get into the streets and drive this regime out. But at the same time, what was driving this fascism, what gave birth to it, was the system itself, which is driving the world towards potentially a point of no return in terms of the extinction of humanity in relationship to the environment itself. Capitalism, there's no Green New Deal that's going to fundamentally redress this. On one level, you can only deal with it on a world scale. And imagine if there was a revolution in this country, how many revolutions would take place around the world? And you can make all the economic arguments you want that green energy was more efficient than fossil fuels, but there's a huge, huge investment of major corporations, and not just the oil companies, but the banks and the whole infrastructure and all of this. And I'm not saying it was absolutely impossible that that over time, some of these companies would transfer to green energy, but they haven't recouped this investment and anything, billions and trillions of dollars. I'm not a political economist. I can't give you the exact figures. But just on this, there's an existential crisis that capitalist system cannot be solved under the terms of the capitalist system. Biden has re-entered the Paris Agreement, but no major country has met the goals of the Paris Agreement, which themselves would be insufficient to deal with the problem. And so, see, people are also trained in a methodology where there's good guys and bad guys, and everybody's for their good guys, and anything the other guy does is always bad. And they're not trained to actually examine things scientifically. This has been a problem we've had in refuse fascism. You know, we had some of those problems around the impeachment, for example, where whatever the Democrats did, we said, oh, that couldn't be any good. And in fact, they put on a pretty good impeachment trial. But we were like, including myself, so obsessed with it, they won't really fight this, that we said they wouldn't fight it when they did fight it. Because instead of looking at the fact that every class in society, every social group in society, everybody faces a bunch of challenges of philosophically necessity. These are things you're presented with a problem. What do? This is coming at us. The Democrats actually did see their lives threatened, literally, as well as the future of the way they think the system should be ruled. They had a lot of necessity to wage a fight around that. Are there more things they could have done in the trial? Sure, there's more things. Those more things, they should have done this, they should have done that. But basically, they put on a trial. The fact of the matter was, and this is very important for the texture going forward, they're up against a very large fascist movement that's not going to go along with them. It would have been extremely unlikely for those Republicans to vote for impeachment. These are the kinds of choices that exist, and you were constantly going to be told to be reasonable, to get the change you can get today and then worry about tomorrow. If they don't really worry about tomorrow, as long as your little turf, your family, you are okay. And you have a whole section of people who should have been out in the streets fighting around this, who didn't fight in the streets. And they've made a situation far worse, where we're facing a situation that when Bob Avakian says we've only bought some time, and we're facing an existential crisis, he goes on to say, so the time there is must not be squandered, mired in oblivious individualism, which is what I've been talking about. I'm just taking care of my family. Hopefully your listeners are more involved, but knows a lot of people who are mired in oblivious individualism, and maybe even some of the people who were with refuse fascism have retreated back into that, or political paralysis, that there's nothing we can do because they're too strong and the Democrats won't do it, and that's not the realpolitik of Washington, or misspent on misdirected activity, Avakian says, that only reinforces the system, which is getting involved from the perspective of the kind of movement for revolution we need in actually going to work on understanding what the problem we face is in this system and what is the solution, and for people to seriously engage that a revolution is possible, how it could be made, and what it could be for. I just want to say that there's, in the Constitution for a new socialist republic and in this new communism, it really is a breakthrough from what came before in the 20th century. And I will defend the revolutions of the 20th century. And there's just so much lies and BS out there about that, where people don't know the heroism that was involved. The people's rights were expanded way beyond what had existed in the capitalist countries. Just take on the oppression of women, for example, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, far more rights than any other country in the world. A lot of that got reversed in the course of the fight to preserve socialism. And there's a whole history to how that was not fought on the right basis, the fight to maintain that power, which was eventually lost anyway. But that's a longer story than we're going to get into today. But the point is, we can't afford this people just retreating into themselves and the individualism and this political paralysis, or being misspent on, oh, we're going to take back the Democratic Party. Well, you know what? Years ago, Bob Avakian said, if you try to make the Democrats what they are not and can never be, you will end up becoming more like what they actually are. And that's the reality of it. There can be some demagoguery, but when you get down to it, you're going to play their game. This statement is an urgent call for people to get into the statement and into this work to understand the nature of the problem we face and the nature of the solution, and to hopefully get involved with the movement for an actual revolution, as well as to take up the continuing need to expose this fascism and to, with Refuse Fascism, form a network of people who are prepared to act when situations emerge where this fascism needs to be opposed on a massive scale to stop its reemergence and contending for actual political power.
Let's talk a little bit more about that last point. I wanted to share another short excerpt. Avakian writes, the reality is that not only in relation to this election, but throughout the 4 years of this regime's rule and its mounting atrocities, there has not been the massive nonviolent mobilization called for by Refuse Fascism to drive out this regime. And in the aftermath of the election, the streets were dominated by fascist mobilizations and not by opposition to fascism. This has resulted in a situation where, despite the Trump-Pence regime's loss in the election, the forces of fascism are still in many ways being strengthened. And the opposition to this has remained much too passive and reliant on the terms set by the Democratic Party. And so I'm wondering, what can we do to change that dynamic and prevent this from playing out in the same way again, if the fascists reseize power?
What this statement argues is that people need to understand the nature, what gave rise to this, what it actually is. It's not just some aberrant of Trump. It's not just the people who've been economically disadvantaged are now being misled, which they are, but that's not the essence of it. In other words, to really understand, these are people who are fighting for, in a revanchist way, for a world that they believe they're entitled to, up against the interests of all humanity. Yes, and ultimately including their own. One of the things we need to do, and what this statement is calling for, is for people to get into the movement for an actual revolution. I think one thing that would have strengthened the fight, I'm sure it would have strengthened the fight against the fascist thing, is if there had been a massive movement for an actual revolution fighting in the streets for this. I say fighting in the streets, I mean in the ways that Refuse Fascism called for, a nonviolent way, but also with real determination and creativity that bring out the underlying causes of this. It would have made a profound difference. We saw that in the 1960s with the emergence first of Malcolm X and then later with the Black Panther Party, that when you actually had a revolutionary Black liberation movement that changed even the terms of the civil rights movement. It actually gave impetus to people to begin to think outside the box. So even on those terms, it's important. Plus, we actually do need a revolution. We really need a revolution. We have in the movement for an actual revolution emphasized that because the fundamental problems of the system, the forms of oppression, women's oppression, gender oppression, oppression of Black and brown people, the environment, the unending wars, the destruction of the environment, all of this cannot be reformed under capitalism. Bacon has said this poses for us two choices. Either we leave the world as it is and condemn future generations to this, if there's any future at all, or we make revolution. That's the big argument in this thing, and it gives people a doorway into finding out about it. At the same time, there's going to be, and there is a need for continued vigilance against this fascist imperative in this society. And I think that that's something that I know, in the editorial board of Refuse Fascism, we're going to be encouraging people to return to why we said, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. And we have to develop the ways that applies in this situation. Now, the organization was formed around a single demand, Refuse Fascism. The single demand was this nightmare must end. The Trump-Pence regime must go. Later on, it became the Trump-Pence regime must go, and then simply Trump-Pence out now. While we did fight for the world to understand that this was a fascist regime, we didn't make that the dividing line among people. We were very consciously tried to put a broad-based demand out there against the Trump-Pence regime because we knew that people from many different political persuasions and who didn't really even understand fascism were opposed to the Trump-Pence regime and saw the danger it would do. While we continued in Refuse Fascism, in relation to our second slogan, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America, understood that this, which was actually very artfully created, just by the way, it says, but as we refuse to accept a fascist America, that's where this was headed. And many people could see that, even as they would constantly say, this isn't fascism, it's neo-fascism, proto-fascism, sort of fascism, all these kinds of things. And then as we approached the election, they were saying it was fascism. And as soon as Biden won, they said, oh, no, I guess it wasn't fascism. Because see, they're not stuck in the essence of it. They don't understand the essence of it. They're only looking at superficial phenomenon. Even people who I considered allies and colleagues and people I learned from in different ways who we did some of these dialogues with would refuse to actually get down into understanding the essence of it, which is that it was a different form of open and more blatant form of dictatorship of the very same system. Fascism, as Bacon says, is an open and aggressive dictatorship trampling on and perverting the rule of law, relying on violence and terror on behalf of the predatory capitalist system, and as an extreme attempt to deal with the profound social division and acute crisis, both within the country and on a global scale. The Democrats are dealing with the same set of contradictions, and they have no answers either. But they do feel very strongly, and many on the basis of principle, on the basis of their bourgeois democratic principles, that That's how this system can best be won. To answer your question, what does refused fascism have to do? What's the role for it? That's something we're going to try and develop as we get more deeply into what shape this battle is going to take. I don't think it means that we're going to be some all-purpose protest organization. That's not what I think it should be. I think it should be what it set out to be. There's a particular role that's not right on the front burner right now, but it's very important that it continue, develop a network, develop principles, have a website, social media, this show, all those kinds of things we are going to really need. Neither do I think it's like every time a fascist group shows up that we're going to go mix it up with them. That's not what we ever thought was going to deal with the problem. See, that also skims the surface. It doesn't get to the roots of it. We have to get to the roots of this system, and that's what I'm arguing for. That's what this statement argues for.
Thank you for that, Andy. As we move to close this conversation, I want to ask what I think is one of the most important questions. Is this statement challenges readers to embrace a ruthlessly scientific approach to everything. And you've spoken to this repeatedly, going beyond understanding the importance of science to solving problems facing humanity, from the pandemic to climate change, to applying science to the study of all social problems and their origins and solutions. One of the reasons I think this is so hard for people is that it is scary. And people have talked about how it's easier to envision the end of the world than it is to envision the end of capitalism. I'm hoping that you can talk about what gives you hope for a minute and why people should be brave enough to look deeply into these questions.
Well, when people say that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine overthrowing capitalism, that's just an expression of people saying, I can't see beyond what is. People can't see beyond the horizon of this system. That's all that means. It just means my vision is very limited. And let me just say this, you've been trained to have a very limited vision. That is the predominant way of thinking in this country. Empiricism, positivism, which means what? It means just deal with what's today and what can come next. And never think about it. How did we get here? What are the constraints on us? Is this system permanent? That's the great discovery of Marx, that bourgeois philosophers, and Bob Avakian begins his book, Breakthroughs, which people should read on the website, revcom.us, with a quote from Marx, where he talks about the philosophers prior have only been able to see things within those confines, to not be able to imagine that this is all that could be, a society that fulfills human needs on the basis of what can benefit a handful of people who own the means of production. This is insane. Avakian has said, in his film Revolution Nothing Less, that people say that communism sounds good on paper, but it can never work. He says, well, capitalism doesn't even sound good on paper. It's an irrational system that developed historically, and it's historically limited, and we can move beyond it. So what gives me hope is that I think there are masses of people all around the world whose not only lives are snuffed out by this system, whether it be women in garment factories in Bangladesh that collapse because we're searching for cheap goods, creating conditions that are as horrific as those in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where women had to leave to their death or be burned to their death over 111 years or 120 years ago, whatever it was, 1911. So this is not necessary, this kind of system. And I think that there's people all around the world that not only are their lives in jeopardy or the children who die before they're 5 years old because they don't have clean water, but the creativity of humanity is consistently stifled by the workings of this system. The pandemic has brought all this into stark view, even within this country. And so this is one where I think people have the capacity to imagine, and it's on us to bring to people. And this is what we do on the RNL show. And in the sphere of discussing fascism, I think Refuse Fascism can do this. But on the RNL show, and in an overall sense, in the work of Bob Avakian, is bringing people a different vision of the problem and the solution and what is possible. The fact that we could have a society as envisioned in this Constitution, where we are able to, as he says, unchain and unleash the tremendous productive and social force of human beings who are enabled and inspired to work and struggle together to meet the fundamental needs of the people and transform society in a fundamental way, while supporting and aiding revolutionary struggle throughout the world, aiming for the final goal of a communist world, which would be free from all exploitation and oppression, while at the same time addressing the truly existential environmental and ecological crisis in a meaningful and comprehensive way, which is impossible under the system of capitalism, imperialism. I think that if people would be determined, back to your question on science, determined to seek the truth and to follow the truth wherever it leads, to not be afraid of that, to not say, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there because it would challenge my whole way of being. but to go there and find out about it and raise your questions. You know, you've got a situation where the educated strata in this country, the intellectuals, think, as Avakian has said, like serfs. And it reminds me of a play called Galileo by the revolutionary playwright Bertolt Brecht, where Galileo talks about his parents working on a sort of forlorn hill trying to cultivate crops. And he's being argued with by a friend who's saying, you've got to really tell them that the earth goes around the sun. He said, well, if I told them that, all the meaning of all these years of their lives toiling away would have no meaning for them. You see, I don't think that's much different than in the intellectuals and the professors of this society and the commentariat in the newspapers, where they refuse to actually look at this, that there's an actual solution to this. They turn their backs on it because they're blinded by what is, by the comfort of living in an imperial country, the parasitism that's involved in that, a form of relativism of proceeding from me and the truth that works for me. And this is a big problem. It's actually no different, frankly. Fundamentally, on a philosophical level, it's no different than these Trumpites. The Trumpites are filled with hatred and bigotry and all of this, but they make up an alternative reality. The progressive intelligentsia is, you know, they want to have compassion for their neighbors and for the world, but they also want to talk about their truth. My truth as this kind of person, that kind of identity, this kind of thing. And they don't want to go to the overall truth. There's only one reality, and we have to deal with that. This is what's at the heart of the methodology that we need to get free. It is the breakthrough in communism that Bob Avakian has made. He's put it on a qualitatively, thoroughly, and consistently scientific basis, not proceeding from whatever, you know, communists have had their own identity politics. Oh, whatever the workers say, whatever the poor say, that's automatically true. They possess this automatically. No, they don't. That has to be brought to them. That has to be struggled with it. Ferocious ideological struggle. You know, it's not about getting paid. It's not about me and mine. It's about us. It's about we. It's about transforming the system that we suffer under. We, the masses in our billions, suffer from. And that there's a way out of this through an actual revolution. That's what we're talking about. And I think this is something people need to know about. And then people will find their relationship to that. And I think that will actually help the broader base movement to oppose these forms of just outrageous and repressive forms of rule of the same system that fascism represents. And hopefully more and more people will be attracted to the movement for an actual revolution and the possibility of a world where humanity could actually flourish. People could be human beings and relate to each other on that basis and not on the basis of what's in it for me and constant negotiation and competition over everything, including the most intimate relations.
Well, I want to thank you, Andy, for coming on and having this conversation with me. You can catch Andy every week on the RNL show at the RevComs on YouTube. And you can read the works of Bob Avakian, including those referenced by Andy, especially A New Year, The Urgent Need for a Radically New World for the Emancipation of All of Humanity at revcom.us. Thanks for listening to the Refuse Fascism podcast. Be sure to follow the show on Apple Podcasts or subscribe on your listening platform of choice so you never miss an episode. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to help us reach more listeners. If you haven't listened yet to episode 50, Learning from the Past to Chart the Future, featuring interviews with Dr. Susan Neiman and Darrell Lamont Jenkins, I encourage you to do so and share with your friends and family. Follow us on social media at Refuse Fascism. To support this show, click the donate button at refusefascism.org or Venmo, refuse-fascism. Cash App, Refuse Fascism. As always, I want to hear from you. Your thoughts on this episode, the show, topics you hope that we'll explore, guests you want to hear from. You can reach me on Twitter at Sam B. Goldman or write me at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Stay safe, not silent.